Mafuya, a very warm welcome to everyone here in Canada and abroad. Bonjour à tous au Canada et en dehors du pays. I am Sheikh Tijan Bangura, Chair of the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council here in Ottawa. I would like to acknowledge that the Africa Study Group is hosting this meeting from Ottawa on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. Je tiens à souligner que nous tenons cette session à partir d'Ottawa, territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe, Algonquin. The Africa Study Group addresses a variety of themes at our monthly events through a series of discussions, including strengthening Canada-Africa relations, the role and importance of the African-Canadian diaspora, Canada-African Union cooperation issues, African free trade area issues, aspects of global health issues, in particular COVID and post-COVID issues, security and stabilization in Africa as an essential condition for sustainable development, unconstitutional changes of government, the impact of violent extremists and terrorism in Africa, particularly jihadism and Boko Haram, security and governance, as well as new geopolitical realities in Africa, notably in the Grand Sahel after the withdrawal decision of French forces from Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and just recently, 2 weeks ago, from Senegal and Chad. Also, climate change issues, particularly COP27, COP28, and the following COPs, as well as cyber attacks, disinformation and their multidimensional consequences, international diplomacy, democracy, and electoral development in Africa. Today, we are talking about South Africa, current political reality, the government of national unity today. La réalité politique actuelle de l'Afrique du Sud, le gouvernement d'unité nationale aujourd'hui. C'est cela notre thème d'aujourd'hui. You will remember that we had a session with this panel last year in April, and we had promised to bring the panel back. That's what we are doing today. This session will be moderated by Dr. Marsha Burdett, Deputy Chair of the Africa Study Group. With a PhD in the political science from Columbia University, New York, 1979, Marsha Burdett pursued an academic career followed by 25 years with Canadian Ministry of International Affairs. She has a long-standing interest in Africa, in particular Central Southern Africa. Her book, Zambia Between Two Worlds, and a series of articles focuses on the major economic transition of the country when its new leaders embarked on the nationalization of the copper industry, the country's main economic engine. Subsequent articles dealt with the import industry for Zimbabwe agricultural sector in 1980s and 1990s. So without further delay, I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Marsha Burnett. Marsha?
Thank you, Sheikh. Thank you for the kind invitation. And thanks to all of you for attending the last Africa Study Group event for 2024. We want to welcome our many listeners from North America, Europe, and Africa. and members of the African Diplomatic Corps in Africa. We may hear from one of the members of the African Corps later on in the session. It's been a very busy year for us, as you've heard from Sheikh talking about all the panels and activities we've been involved with, and you can follow them if you look at the africastudygroup.com website. I'm just going to add one little personal note before we get into the core of the session. I was part of a Government of Canada delegation to South Africa for observing the first democratic election in April of 1994. At that time, it was pretty unclear the future of this divided country. Our hopes were certainly that the charismatic Nelson Mandela would bring the peoples together. And the African National Congress, the ANC, won that election and gained a majority in every election until this past May 2024. Now, what's happened next is an experiment, it seems to me, for South Africans, this government of national unity. With the assistance of a new member of our secretariat, Ms. Mawena Torkunu, we've asked two speakers today to delve into this unique arrangement and see how it's working out, giving us a general understanding of how South Africa's evolving landscape is going. Now, I'll start by introducing both of our speakers. They will then engage in an informal discussion between themselves, which we call the armchair discussion. Some people call it fireside chat. And then at the end of the session, we have about an hour and a half total, we will have a portion of time for question and answers. Please be sure to write any questions or you may have into the Q&A function on the Zoom. And we will check that and try to make sure to draw the questions to the attention of the panelists. So let me start with reading quickly the bios of our two speakers for today. This first up will be David Hornsby. And David is the Vice Provost and Associate Vice President Academic and a professor at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. He was previously a faculty member and head of the Department of University College, London, Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy. He also spent 8 years as a faculty member of the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa in the Department of International Relations, where he also served as the Assistant Dean of Humanities. His research interests pertain to pedagogy and philosophy of higher education, the politics of science and risk in international governance, and African and Canadian international relations. He has a strong interdisciplinary research record, having published in both the biological and social sciences, and is an award-winning lecturer. David currently sits on the board of Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, the Digital Policy Studies, the Center for Engaged Learning Open Book Series at Elon University, and is co-editor of the Political Pedagogy Series for Palgrave. David currently serves as the chair of the board for Volunteer Ottawa and has served on the Governing Council of International Studies Association, the World University Service of Canada, and the Canadian Bureau for International Education. With all these activities, we're very lucky he's made the time to talk to us today. The second panelist is Dr. Oscar van Heerden. Dr. van Heerden is with us today from Cape Town, South Africa. He's a scholar of international relations where he focuses on international political economy with an emphasis on Africa, SADC, the Southern Africa Development Community in particular. He completed his PhD and master's studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK from 2006-2010. He then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Johannesburg under the NRF Chair for International Relations and African Diplomacy, Professor Chris Landsberg. He entered active politics in 1985 as a student and youth activist. He's an avid writer and analyst of contemporary politics in South Africa. He has served in numerous political capacities in the ANC and other mass democratic movement organizations. He continues to speak truth to power through his ongoing daily maverick opinion pieces to this day. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm going to turn over to David Hornsby to get us launched.
Thanks very much, Marcia, and a big thanks to the CIC and to the Africa Study Group for the invitation to come back and speak with you about the Government of National Unity and the current state of politics. Grateful to everybody who's joined online. I see a number of familiar names there. Particularly want to recognize His Excellency Mo Sheikh, the High Commissioner of South Africa to Canada. Thank you for joining us, Mo. And I see here we also have Gaston Barba, the former High Commissioner of Canada to South Africa, with us. And my former colleague, Professor Linda Freeman, who has been a pivotal scholar in understanding Canada-South Africa relations. So a particular and warm welcome to those three colleagues, but as well to everybody else who's joining us. It's always fun to be here and to have these sorts of conversations with Oscar. We would often do it when we were PhD students together at Cambridge, but also when we were colleagues and comrades in South Africa. You know, South African politics is currently in a state of significant transition following its 2024 general elections, I think, which marked a historic shift in the country's political landscape. The election results have reshaped the power dynamics and governance structure of the nation. You know, the African National Congress, which has dominated South African politics since the end of apartheid in 1994, experienced a substantial decline in support. For the first time, the ANC failed to secure a parliamentary majority, winning only 40% of the vote, down from 57% in 2019. This outcome has led to the formation of the Government of National Unity, or what is colloquially called the GNU, which is ultimately a coalition comprising of the ANC, the Democratic Alliance, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and the Patriotic Alliance as a major party, coalition members. But there are a whole bunch of others as well. This coalition government is led by Cyril Ramaphosa, who was reelected to the position of president after he served in the role for 4 years previously. And this power-sharing arrangement has given smaller parties and seen modest cabinet positions in exchange for supporting Ramaphosa's presidency. A significant development since the last time we discussed South African politics has been the creation and the strong performance of the Umkhonto we Sizwe Party, the left-wing populist party founded just 6 months before the election by former President Jacob Zuma. MK, as it's colloquially called, secured the third highest number of votes, further fragmenting the political landscape. The coalition government faces significant economic challenges, including high unemployment, power shortages, and the need and prescient demand for inclusive growth. President Ramaphosa has emphasized job creation and inclusive economic growth as central focuses of the GNU. But addressing corruption remains a major issue. And it is clear that the government is working to implement recommendations of the Zondo Commission to reduce the potential for corruption, or what was called state capture. But the ongoing energy crisis, characterized by frequent load shedding or rolling blackouts, continues to be a significant challenge and a daily reality. And this issue has contributed to public's dissatisfaction more broadly with the ANC governance and is a factor for the GNU. But in true South African form, these challenges never outweigh the possibilities and opportunities, and dare I say potentialities, of the democratic dispensation that has now been the case for over 30 years. South Africa has just assumed the presidency of the G20. It continues to engage in advancing moral questions of our time, such as leading the case against Israel for its military actions in Gaza at the ICJ, and continues to play a core role in advancing the BRICS alliance. Fortunately, as Marcia noted today, we do have the opportunity to chat with Oscar, who is an academic and an analyst and a policy insider, and somebody who understands the GNU very, very closely. He has been, I should note as well, in addition to being a commentator, a prolific writer on the ANC, having published now 3 books, right? One is called Consistent and Confused, The Politics of Mbeki's Foreign Policy, 2 Minutes to Midnight, which is an analysis of Ramaphosa's ascent to power, and his most recent one, Is the Party Over? A prescient analysis of political forces and realities leading up to the 2024 election. So I'm particularly excited today that we're going to do a little bit of an exploration, but I do hope that colleagues here and friends joining us feel welcome to put in their questions into the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to them as part of our discussion. Oscar, over to you.
Thanks, David. Thanks for those insights. Perhaps, it's not always a good idea to start on a slight disagreement, but I do think, for the sake, I know it's going to come up a bit later, but for the sake of the discussion, I think that it's commonly held that MKP, the Mkhonto we Sizwe Party, is a so-called left-wing radical party. On the contrary, I think it's a right-wing fascist party, being anti-constitution, it's anti-Roman Dutch common law, and it is wanting to elevate tribalism as the final arbiter in politics. So, but I think it is a debatable point, but they're certainly not left-wing, as far as I'm concerned. But having said that, thank you to Marsha and Dr. Bugari for the Africa Study Group, as well as the CIC, yet again for this opportunity. I agree with everything that David has said. Suffice to say that there is currently a conversation which tries to equate the Government of National Unity of 1994 with the current GNU. I think some of the discussions and the points are misplaced. I don't think that there was necessarily any comparison, except to say that the ANC strategically chose not to call the multi-party coalition government a grand coalition between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, which is the main opposition party. I think, for obvious reasons, they read the political landscape in South Africa, and that wasn't necessarily going to go down well. Even though, of course, being the main opposition party, it was a coup de grace for it to be included in the Government of National Unity. And so the ANC decided to refer to an old concept that people are familiar with, but in a different form, and that is the Government of National Unity, and it consists of 10 political parties. Notwithstanding that there was many more that actually contested the 2024 elections. I think the other point I want to perhaps also make is, as your members would know, that there has been an overall sea change throughout the world in 2024 with general elections. People were generally seeking change, the operative word being change. The Tories fell in the UK and gave an absolute majority to Labour, the first time in a very long time. We saw Macron being under pressure and having to call a snap election. In France, we know that Schulz's government is under enormous pressure and is likely to lose the next general election, and so on and so forth. And we see, of course, the absolute stunner of Trump taking just about everything and turning the United States red. And so Africa and Southern Africa was not immune to that. We saw a 53-year run of the Botswana National Party coming to an end, with a new opposition party taking the driving seat. We saw tension and potential vote rigging that happened in Mozambique's election, and still there are protests and violent actions taking place in and around Maputo. We waited with bated breath to see the outcome of the Namibian elections, which I think everyone has now tacitly accepted that SWAPO remains in charge there. And of course, South Africa was also not immune to the sea change, and hence the ANC, as David has said, fell below 50. It was generally sort of accepted that it would hover around 45, 47%, but a complete clangor to find themselves at 40% and having to suddenly think on their feet and scuttle to form a government. Having said that, I think it's also important to mention, and I'm sure some of your people would want to engage with it, the ANC remarkably coming out of this in a very, very good way. For a party to get 40% and still be completely in charge of government, getting the presidency, the deputy presidency, and the Speaker of the House, and the overall majority of cabinet posts, speaks to what I would call a bit of a concern. And I've written about this, and we can discuss it, David. I think it's more a feature, not so much about the very capable negotiating team of the ANC, but also a feature of the opposition parties never really being ready to govern the country. Not, there was the talk of shadow ministers and the talk of we are ready to take over, but they were all found wanting, just never expecting to having to take the reins of power. And I think that's actually what compromised some of the opposition parties, and they were on a back foot and they felt much more relieved to give the ANC a larger chunk of responsibility. Having said that, the Democratic Alliance, as I said, the main opposition, did manage to secure 6 ministerial posts. And of course, we can debate about whether those were significant or not. I think they were quite significant. The big tension, which I think the Africa Group would be interested in this current GNU, is that there is significant fallout and disagreements around foreign policy choices. There is disagreement around, as David mentioned, taking Israel to the ICJ. There's disagreement around Ramaphosa, the president, calling Putin a friend and an ally. There's disagreement, of course, with our closeness and cozy relationship with Xi Jinping's government in China, and generally not a comfortableness with BRICS and what the opposition party, DA, believes is a move away from the West, from America, from Europe. So we are currently having current debates and arguments around where to locate foreign policy choices. Of course, the governing party and the president will tell you that the prerogative of foreign policy is in the presidency, and therefore the president is the number one diplomat. And it's not really a cabinet matter. Others would obviously disagree, the DA in particular and some other political parties, saying that they want a say in what choices we make globally going forward. And then, of course, coupled to that is not only a successful BRICS summit, and I'm sure some people would want to touch on that, but also the upcoming chairpersonship of the G20 that's coming to Johannesburg next year. Now, one other last point to make before I get into conversation with some of the people is the current situation is multifold. And what I mean by that is there are different perceptions about the choice to form a government of national unity. There is a school of thought that says that President Ramaphosa should have kept the coalition politics amongst the predominantly Black parties. Economic Freedom Fighters, the MKP, Umkhonto we Sizwe Party, and perhaps one or two others, and not necessarily invite the predominantly, not exclusively, but the predominantly white party as the opposition, the Democratic Alliance. Then there's a school that says we are happy with the GNU, We are happy that our democracy has matured to a point where we can now form coalition politics and play coalition politics. After all, this is the norm in Europe and in North America and elsewhere, and we are simply joining that bandwagon, and that means our democracy is maturing. And then, of course, there is a school that is saying that we are not happy at all with this government of national unity for the simple reason that the perception is that the ANC and Ramaphosa has now yet again given power back into the hands of white South Africans, the very people that oppressed us, the very people that were responsible for apartheid. How dare we? How could we? Etc. They are fundamentally opposed to this, including partners in the tripartite alliance with the African National Congress, some of the trade unions, some of the members of the South African Communist Party. So much so that for the first time ever, the South African Communist Party has now mentioned that they will go into the local government elections of 2026 as an independent standalone party. And that, of course, speaks volumes as to what their approach will be to the next general election in 2029. Personally, I think it's a good thing that they stop talking and start taking some action, because after all, it is what democracy is about. I think let me stop there for now, Marcia, and then I think we can take some questions and clarifications. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Oscar. And it's always great to get your high-level analysis, and appreciate the number of different themes that you've hit on. I think today it would be great, just for the focus of our conversation, to sort of put things into two question buckets. And I thought maybe we could focus on the domestic side of things, the configuration of the GNU and that type of politics up front, and then maybe round off with a broader discussion around foreign policy and perhaps some of the ways in which South Africa is orienting itself on some of these questions. Fully appreciating that sometimes all that sort of comes in together. So we started with a disagreement about the position of the MK as a left-wing party versus a right-wing fascist party. I mean, I would portend a suggestion that it's actually neither, because it hasn't developed a sufficient policy position stance. It formed as a protest. It is an ethnic tribalist type of party, as you suggested, is regionally based. On many levels, one could argue it mirrors, in the Canadian sense, a Bloc Québécois type of position, namely it's stuck in a particular provincial area. But the impact of the MK party, despite all of that, has been enormous. It came up out of nowhere and shot to third place, disrupting and displacing the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters. Before we get into elements of the GNU, perhaps we could just unpack that phenomenon for a moment, namely that the GNU has taken and brought in almost all the political parties, with the exception of the Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, and the MK. And what does that tell us? What does that tell us about Parliament? What does that tell us about the future of policy decision-making, or at least the condition of policymaking in South Africa at present?
Yeah, let's start with the EFF. I mean, I think the EFF has simply just run its course. For the longest time, they were seen as a possible alternative, particularly to young Black voters, millennials, some perhaps Gen Z, but unfortunately, the woes within the party, the difficulties and challenges that the leaders were facing and so forth, simply played out. And as a result, they were losing more and more support as the years went by. And I think MK, the emergence of MK, the MKP, sort of just took that to another level, and it gobbled up some of the support. So that's that, and of course the EFF is having their conference, and hopefully will elect their new leadership. We'll see some of the senior leaders of EFF has abandoned ship and has actually gone to MK as a future political home. So I think that's sort of where I would place EFF. MK, on the other hand, I want to give a much more nuanced analysis, and it is about, firstly, the leader of the party, Jacob Zuma, former president of the African National Congress. If you read both my last two books, one of the things that I don't necessarily highlight, but when you read it, becomes obvious, is the fact that on both 5 yearly conferences, elective conferences of the ANC, KwaZulu-Natal forwarded a candidate for presidency. In 2017, their candidate was Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, ex-wife of Jacob Zuma, a very astute politician, a very ethical politician, and for all intents and purposes would have made a good leader and a good president. The problem with her presidency or her candidacy was that the team that rallied around her was some of the more rotten apples within the ANC. You know, the strongmen, political types, Ace Magashule, Didi Mabuza, and so forth and so on. And it was not a team that the ANC majority was comfortable with. And so they voted Dlamini Zuma down. And so the Zulus from KwaZulu-Natal took umbrage at that loss. And it was a great loss because Jacob Zuma really wanted his ex-wife to be the next president so that some of his legal woes could go away, and so on and so forth. They then come back 5 years later as KwaZulu-Natal, and this time with a much stronger force, wanting to impose their candidate yet again in the form of Dr. Mkhize, another Zulu. And again, Zweli Mkhize, good candidate, ethical leader for all intents and purposes, strong minister and so forth, government experience, and would have probably made a good president. Again, the problem was that the nature and forcefulness and the anti-Ramaphosa sentiment did not go down well at that conference of 2022. And so again, KwaZulu-Natal gets defeated and Ramaphosa takes a second term. And so they return to the province, wounded, disgruntled, irritated, that for a second time they have now been destroyed or they've lost the battle. Zuma plays on that sentiment and also understands the tribal Zulu element that is very pervasive within KwaZulu-Natal. One of the strongest tribal royal houses in the country remains the Zulu king, very much supported by the ANC provincial government in terms of resources, funding, etc. They take it very serious. They take the royal house very serious, and so on and so forth. And Zuma understood this. And so he galvanized, at first very secretively, using some of his people that is embedded in the ANC and in government, and finally delivers this decisive blow at the last minute of the 2024 election, taking from the most populist province 2 million votes away from the ANC. And if you do the calculation, it is precisely that number of 2 million votes that would have kept the ANC above the 50 percentile, and therefore in charge. And so I think that he had thought that they would take the province convincingly. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And the ANC, with clever coalition politics with some parties, having now done the deal at national level, were able to outmaneuver MK even in KwaZulu-Natal, to the utter anger and frustration of Zuma and others. However, having said that, this is not an EFF. They quickly, given the percentile that they got in the national elections, they quickly reorganized themselves, recruited much more substantive and serious candidates into the party, reconfigured their national list for parliament, brought in heavyweights such as former Judge President of the Western Cape, Hlophe. They brought in people like Brian Molefe and others. And these are people, as far as I'm concerned, David, already smells and sees themselves in cabinet come 2029. So it is certainly a force to be reckoned with. I think if the ANC missteps and continues to misstep and not have their pulse on the ground and not organized amongst the people, they are going to find themselves out of power with an MK in power.
You know, there's a lot of what you just said resonates with me. I think, you know, coming to the question that's currently in the Q&A, which is about what, you know, is EFF a spent force? I think it's always a bit dangerous after one election to proffer a view on that. I mean, I do hold the position though that the EFF, in terms of its base, has a diminishing power base of influence. For what you've seen, the students that were the backing of it in previous elections have now gotten older. They're getting families, they've got mortgages, they've got jobs, their interests and orientations are changing. So it'll be interesting to see if the EFF can galvanize the next generation of younger voters to its support. And, you know, it doesn't have the fees must fall, it doesn't have the roads must fall campaigns going on in the same level of veracity as before. But, you know, the interesting piece about the MK, you know, which I wonder, you know, did you just neglect to leave it out because you'd like to bring it up later, is that, you know, while the MK was formed out of the protest and perhaps feeling somewhat begrudged after not getting their person in the conference, the ANC conference, is it not also because of as well some of the more active investigations and circling of the NPA and other law enforcement agencies around Zuma and his cronies that also activated this type of show of political force, namely to demonstrate that, you know, that he can't be discounted, that despite some of these more significant charges?
No, absolutely. I mean, it actually is a very, very important point. A lot of the people that are now in MK are people that are facing the long arm of the law, facing all kinds of charges of fraud, corruption, and so forth. And so that makes them even more dangerous. I think it's important to make that point. They are very determined because it is a matter of imprisonment or actually the seat of power. And so they are very motivated and very focused. As I say, you know, if ever there was an understanding that they were confused molecules at the beginning of this process, they're certainly not that now. They've got their ducks in a row. There's still a bit of tension because being the megalomaniac that Zuma is, he still wants to exert his power. He's firing people from the party left, right, and center. It's causing some consternation and legal woes. But I do think that Zuma, in my opinion, must tread lightly because he's now brought in such heavyweights that soon he himself might become obsolete if he continues on this dictatorial manner. I wouldn't be surprised, you know, also because of his age. I think that people in MK is already of the opinion, if you ask me, that this is not a family party. This is not a Zuma party. You know, they feel quite strongly about the views of being anti-ANC and wanting to project their power in that particular fashion. So, the NPA, just by virtue of a side point, for some or other reason, is moving very slowly on a number of these cases. Notwithstanding that it is a number of cases, whether it's Lucky Montana at Prasa and what's happened there, whether it's Brian Molefe and Eskom, and so on and so forth. The Judge Shrope himself had his legal woes in being removed from his position as judge president and so on and so forth. So they all have got some skin in the game, and they know that if they don't come out tops, they will soon be inside a jail. So no, not having to neglect that point. I think it's a very, very valid point. But as you know, Zuma has managed to stay out of jail for all of almost 20 years.
I mean, which is a remarkable feat, given the charges that he's had facing him, and as well some of the judgments and rulings against him. But so it's clear to me, MK, EFF are protest parties on a level, comprised of people who have axes to grind on the basis of either being removed from a position or feeling neglected some way, shape, or form. But let's pivot now a bit to the GNU, right? And the formation of that. On a level, what a masterstroke of genius on the to come up with this idea, especially at the end of an election that was a surprise, and that had a surprising result, and in particular had a surprising reconfiguration of political positioning. So I don't know if you had any insight on the basis of your political connections around how the GNU idea emerged, especially given the past, right? I mean, this is not 1994, this is 30 years later, and South African politics are very, very different. But maybe in that as well, when discussing the formation of the GNU and how it came about as an idea, as a concept, perhaps you could proffer some ideas around how it's facilitating South Africa and the South African government in particular addressing some of the prescient challenges around corruption, unemployment, things like the energy crisis. I don't know if you could tie those together.
Look, I mean, I'll answer it in two ways, David. I mean, firstly, I think it wasn't necessarily a difficult idea to come up with the concept of GNU, as I said earlier, because it had existed before. People were saying, I would imagine, and I wasn't the fly on the wall, unfortunately, but I would imagine, and knowing some of the comrades involved, the conversation would have been something to the effect of, firstly, what do we do now? We had anticipated the potential of dipping below 50. We had thought that we might only have to form a coalition government with 2 or 3 of the smaller parties. But the loss is so significant that if we go that route, it might hamper progress and just moving forward in terms of government. And so we will have to include 1 or 2 of the major parties. And someone then said, to avoid this perception of a grand coalition with the DA, which a lot of people had issues with, why don't we have a multi-party coalition? But let's not make it sound like a multi-party coalition. Let's call it the GNU, Government of National Unity, which brings me to the next point, which is that the ANC, though they would never admit it, have come to appreciate being a single governing party for so long that they have had to bear the full responsibility of governance and of delivery to the people. And 30 years on, it's perhaps not a bad idea to start sharing some of that responsibility and giving some responsibility to those that think things are black and white and easy in the opposition benches. And so perhaps just as a way of highlighting the point, I was at a gathering where the Minister of Basic Education was in attendance. This is a minister from the Democratic Alliance. And she was asked, what was your first day like? Was it a cultural shock? Tell us all about it. And her answer was absolutely telling. She said, firstly, governance is complex. Now, this is not someone a few months ago who was screaming from the opposition benches and made it look as if everything is simple and black and white. The second thing she then says is, because then she was prompted, explain. And she says, I thought when I got into office, I would have to choose between right and wrong. But increasingly, every day I go to the office, I have to decide which right is more right. And it makes it so much more difficult. Do you remove a school feeding scheme that is feeding millions of children in primary schools because you think it's a wastage of money and can be best put elsewhere? Or do you keep that going because for many of those children, it's the only single meal that they're having for the day? And so suddenly things are not so black and white, and so on and so forth. Another example, just by way of demonstrating the point, is, the leader of the opposition party, John Steenhuisen, with all his strong views, anti-China, etc., had to accompany the president, to China, and had to bow in front of Xi Jinping, because this is what is customary. Never in his wildest dreams did he think he would ever find himself in that position. And so I'm saying that it's a healthy thing to begin to share a bit of responsibility, to show that governance is complex, not easy. And I think that it can only be a healthy thing towards the bigger picture of our democracy. So you're right in terms of the GNU obviously has its particular peculiarities and differences. There's, for example, currently another controversial point, which I don't think is a controversial point, but clearly the Democratic Alliance do. And this is a new form of legislation with regards to the use of language in schools. And really all the legislation is saying is that we need to respect other languages. It needs to be a multilingual environment and not necessarily promoting one language above others. And those that speak Afrikaans, predominantly white Afrikaners, feel this is such an attack on their culture and their language. And some Canadians will understand this kind of politics. But the GNU continues. It's not falling apart because there's an understanding that these are not issues that make or break the country or governance for that matter. And I think, as I say, this is a healthy thing, but it doesn't mean it's going to hold. There will always be something around the corner that might break the camel's back.
No, absolutely, as is thus with coalition politics. I think one of the surprising pieces, at least we're now looking like we're almost a year in, is how stable things seem to be within the GNU and at the cabinet table. Now,
perhaps the quiet before the storm.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it depends on when the next political cycle starts, right? When they start preparing for the next election, because they all will contest the election separately. But one of the clear pieces from the last election was the level of dissatisfaction with Ramaphosa more broadly across South Africa to address some of the critical challenges, namely that around corruption. Of course, unemployment, of course, energy production, load shedding dimensions. But the thing that stuck in people's craw was the corruption piece. Now, for those as outsiders, it would just be like, why couldn't the president act? With the nuance, obviously, was that Ramaphosa was moderated by the National Executive Committee of the ANC, and in particular, how they preferred constraining the president's actions around holding particular people to account. Do you think that the GNU has, on a level, given Ramaphosa and his acolytes cover to address and to moderate and to put at bay the National Executive Committee of the ANC in a more significant way, so that he can go after some of the more significant issues pertaining to corruption and, dare I say, service delivery more broadly?
I don't think so, David. I don't think so. I think the attitude of the opposition parties within the GNU is that the law must take its course. They know, or they are perhaps of the opinion that the rhetoric from the ANC about renewal and wanting to clamp down on corruption, etc., might be precisely that, rhetoric. But there are real cases. There are real evidence that came out of the Zondo Commission, that came out of independent investigations and so forth. And so for them, they want the NPA and the prosecuting authority to do their job and to do it diligently and with more speed. Because as Ramaphosa and others in the ANC will quickly remind you, that is not something that they can get involved in. They don't want to interfere with prosecutorial processes. That is left up to the National Prosecuting Authority. And I think that the DA and other parties would want Batoy, the head of the NPA, and chief prosecutor, to actually move with greater speed to prosecute these people. And so as to why that is not happening, I don't know. I don't think there's any political interference at all. Those were the days of the Zuma presidency, when they tried to appoint incompetent people to run the NPA and so forth in order to be able to manipulate it. But one of the good and great things that Ramaphosa did, and it will certainly be part of his legacy, was, people say you can't take accolades for a fish that swims. But the truth of the matter is, David, and the damage that was done by the Zuma era, not only with regards to the prosecuting authority, but also with the revenue services, with Treasury, and a number of other parastatals, was such that the first 5 years of the Ramaphosa presidency was to undo those things and to put those institutions on a better footing and a more independent footing. And so I can almost with absolute certainty say that there is no interference that's happening at the prosecutorial level. But yes, there are other contentious issues. As you know, 2024, I just earlier today finished an article sort of rounding up the year 2024. And one of the key accolades, again, it's not about teaching a fish to swim, but under the Ramaphosa administration, eventually, due to perseverance, due to having appointed a Minister of Electricity, which everyone laughed about and scoffed at, we now, for about more than 230 days of the year, have not had any load shedding, no major electricity interruptions. It seems the utility is back on the right path, getting the act together. Of course, they now want to extort the taxpayers with a significant hike in electricity prices, but the regulatory body as well as the government is putting a bit of a pause to that and saying, hold on, we can't punish those that actually provide the bread. So, from an energy point of view, and of course, that's also spurned a whole industry in terms of private providers, in terms of alternate energy sources, whether it be solar, wind, and so forth. So that has now also created a whole employment opportunity, and I think that will continue. So that's a good thing. And then, of course, on the element of corruption, there will always be disagreement, even amongst pundits and analysts and so forth. Yes, corruption is a big problem, especially in government. But we must equally understand that the political economy of corruption in South Africa is also very pervasive within the private sector. Mining houses from days gone by and old, decades and decades, have been involved in all manner of corruption and collusion with government officials and so on and so forth. And
the apartheid regime was corrupt, right? I mean, that be very clear, right? Yeah. Absolutely.
And to think that kind of white-collar corruption suddenly went away in 1994 is certainly a misnomer. We've seen Mark Uster, we've seen so many of these scandals collusion with the banking sector, collusion in the flower sector, collusion in the bicycle sector, for that matter, for those who are cyclists and so on. But suffice to say, it is a problem, and there will always be disagreements about how to tackle it. But I think what's important is that the government took a decision, unlike many governments, David, to actually establish a commission to actually wash the dirty linen in public, to bring people to account, and so on and so forth. And now we are waiting with bated breath to actually see what action, remedial action, is going to be taken with the recommendations coming out of that Zondo Commission. And I think that is a big plus.
So just to, I mean, push you a little bit, right? So at the crux of my question really was about the relationship between the presidency, the cabinet, and the ANC NEC. And before this last election, the connection points were far more significant. Namely, the NEC would give the president his marching orders, and the president would need to test public policy positions quite regularly with the NEC first and get blessings before really moving forward. Under a government of national unity, I presume that can't be the case anymore. So what is the significance of the NEC anymore, the ANC machination piece, in the functioning of government?
The attitude from the NEC is that they are still in government and they are still in charge. And so I don't see anything significantly changing in terms of their thinking. Of course, there were those that were in the negotiating team to negotiate an agreement between all these parties. And it's those individuals that would remind the NEC time and time again that, what you want to see happening is not necessarily going to be the case. You need to take into consideration that we have a different power relation and configuration at a national level. And I think they're still trying to wrap their heads around that, if you ask me. It hasn't necessarily sunk in. It would be interesting, of course, to see what will happen as we go towards the national, the national commission of the ANC, which is in between the 5 yearly elective conferences. Because that's really going to be the first time that thousands of ANC members come together under one roof and deliberate and analyze what happened in the elections and why, and two, was our choices the correct one, and should there be some correction? And I think that is when Ramaphosa's power and his power base is going to be put to the test, whether he commands the support of the majority or not. If you ask me, I think that he is going to have the support of the majority, and people are going to generally take the attitude, which is, how do we manage this GNU so that what is called in the ANC the National Democratic Revolution and its objectives is still actually being satisfied, even as we hold hands with some of the opposition parties. And I think that's sort of and then of course the next big question is, we're in this arrangement. Some might argue this is now the permanent arrangement going forward. I think there's a healthy dose of individuals in the ANC that says it was a necessary convenience, but as we go to 2029, we need to try and say the ANC needs to get its majority back.
So switching now maybe to foreign policy, there's a number of really interesting things going on, and South Africa seems to be at the center of it. But, one of the pieces that I've been particularly interested in as an observer is this stance of non-alignment. And I've not necessarily been a big believer in the use of that term and the at least the assertion that South Africa is non-aligned. But I wondered if you had any thoughts of how that notion might be evolving under the government of national unity and in relation to its BRICS partnerships, obviously its position at the ICJ, in its relationships with Western allies?
Look, I mean, I think again, it's clever footwork. When you are in a government of national unity, in a coalition arrangement, you don't necessarily want to come out guns blazing as to your ideological orientation and or your preferences internationally. But having said that, you know, the ANC as a political party has always embraced the element of non-alignment, even when it was not in power in the ANC. In South Africa. You know, it placed a lot of emphasis on non-alignment due to the fact that, but in the days when the ANC were in exile, the Cold War was at its height between America and the Soviet Union, and it just made sense that when these two elephants are fighting, you really don't want to be able to say I'm on this side or on this side. And so when they came into government, they continued with this stance of non-alignment. I think, as you know, the non-aligned movement, of which Canada also participated in, it sort of fizzled out in a way. It died down because of the dominance of the United States for so long. But as soon as there was the BRICS formation, the emergence of China, and of course the non-diminishing of Russia, I don't know, you know, or let's say the campaign of the 1990s to fragment and break Russia up and so forth, when that turned a corner and didn't happen because of Putin, I think there was this re-emergence of tension between great powers, and the ANC, now in government, decided that, you know what, we need to go back to a familiar position, which is non-alignment. And of course, non-alignment doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion on matters, as we've seen in the case of Russia-Ukraine, as we've seen in the case of Israel in Gaza, and of course the genocide that's taking place there.
So, but I mean, how can it be, right, a viable position when South Africa quite regularly agitates and advocates for a new world order? How can it be non-aligned when it takes an active part in the BRICS? How can it be non-aligned when it goes to the ICJ and makes claims of genocide against Israel? That's the bit that I find the hard piece to square here, is the use of that term when it's taking clear position. So maybe you can give some insight on the basis of your understanding of South African foreign policy.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think the non-alignment was a convenient issue with regards to when there's conflict and tension and war, including a Cold War, as we see emerging again now with America and China. And I think that's where the non-alignment becomes convenient, and saying we're not going to choose to our own detriment, because a choice is not going to be in our benefit either way. You know, we're just going to deliberately place ourselves in the firing line, either from the US or from China, or et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's where the non-alignment element comes in. However, it doesn't necessarily, and I see the point you're making, David. I don't think that the Department of International Relations and Cooperation necessarily sees non-alignment that is a blanket position on all of foreign policy. You know, and that this is really sort of the approach. And perhaps, I mean, having heard that the High Commissioner is in the audience, he might want to venture a point or two on this. But I don't think this is the understanding of DIRCO, or the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. They still feel that they see a particular world order. They are still going to advocate for changes of multilateral institutions, including the UN and the UN Security Council, and all these other things, changes of the financial systems and so forth and so on. It doesn't necessarily mean that non-alignment suggests that you are so non-aligned that you don't actually take policy decisions when it is in your national interest.
It's an a la carte non-alignment position.
I like that.
Select non-aligned moments. I think obviously I think there's so much going on in terms of South Africa's involvement in key international issues. But one of the ones, I think the big ones that sort of really getting a lot of interest here in Canada in particular is the opportunity that South Africa is taking as president of the G20, and the lineup with Canada being taking on the presidency of the G7. Wondering about whether or not you give any critical reflections around South Africa's plans for its presidency of the G20 and what possibilities might be to advance some of those agendas with countries like Canada, who is also part of the G20.
No, of course. I mean, the truth is, David, that the sort of policy emphasis that Brazil put on the agenda with regards to G20 this year was always sort of very much in line with South Africa's general outlook, addressing poverty, looking at things in a sustainable manner, wanting to see some significant change, transformation happening with international financial institutions and so forth. And credit to Lula, that's what he placed on the agenda and certainly moved some few steps in advancement of that. Now, those, as I say, are traditional issues that South Africa would have wanted to also have on the agenda, and indeed, they will take some of that forward. But this time around, I think the significant contributor, that the marked difference, if I can call it that, is that they're going to have to place the Africa center, front and center. This is the first time an African country is having the chairpersonship of the G20. I speak under correction, but I think it's the first time it's even going to happen on the continent. Mm-hmm. And so, it would be really a miscalculation on the part of the Ramaphosa government not to actually bring the Africa 2030, 2065 agenda, placing it front and center and saying, yes, there are issues of the global south that concerns us, that needs attention around climate, around the SDGs, etc. But more specifically, you are not leaving this continent at the end of this G20, not taking on board very significant critical African issues, hotspots, conflict, peace, trade, and not just resource extraction, but talking meaningfully about beneficiation, becoming a manufacturing hub, working together, and not this unequal relationship that persists, talking about debt that is completely killing the continent, and also holding, as you've seen, the COP-out at COP29, holding those countries responsible to say, you cannot only make commitments and not honor those commitments and expect us to talk about just energy transition, to talk about all these things that comes out of the lexicon of Davos, and you are not prepared to actually making the money available to Africa. So I think that's sort of going to be the driving elements. And of course, as you know, the theme of the South Africans is equality, sustainability, and one other, I forget.
Well, fortunately, we actually have Mo Sheikh here with us, and wondered if we could patch Mo in maybe at this moment to offer some reflections around what he thinks are some of the possibilities, not only for South Africa just with G20, but for the Canada G7 and the South Africa G20 alignment. But
also, David, if I can put Mo on in a bit of a corner, I want him to also address this non-alignment issue.
Yeah, fair enough. Mo, can you speak?
Can you hear me? I'm just unmuted.
Yeah.
Yes, we hear you.
Fascinating discussion by the both of you, and I love the way you grapple with the issues. And I agree with almost all that has been said. But I will touch on two issues which I think is important, and I think Oscar tried in his very diplomatic way, and that is firstly on the notion of corruption. I really want to caution against the explaining via regression analysis that South Africa's problems is only about corruption. And I think both of you did not intend that. But it is also a useful, idiotic narrative, because then it means that as a country, we don't have to grapple with the fundamental fault lines that we inherited from apartheid. As long as we say it is corruption, then it is about the current government's corruption and not about the legacies that we've inherited, which are basically underdevelopment, inequality, poverty, etc. But this is also taking place, David, at a time in which capitalism itself and the changes that capitalism has gone through in its new liberal form is going to make it fundamentally different for any country to be able to catch up, to be able to deal with the legacy issues. So even re-industrialization, because our economies were de-industrialized to a large extent and financialized in another extent, because the dominant form of capitalism today is financialization and commodification and everything. So those two problems are in a way fueling what I often refer to as South Africa's unique polycrisis. So I just wanted to locate the issue of corruption. And I think, yes, all of us must deal with all the issues of corruption. And we should do it through the NPA, we should do it through law enforcement agencies. But I just want to caution that even if we do that, if we do not address, as you know, and Oscar will tell you, once upon a time, we understood the notion of a dominant contradiction and fundamental contradiction. If we don't grapple with the fundamental contradictions, we will be having this discussion for quite a while. Let me turn to the issue of non-alignment. And this is essentially where I think the thrust of South Africa's arguments are not fully understood. I think South Africa should be given credit because it stumbled upon this thing that the entire international legal system is now at stake. It is fundamentally at stake, where there is also the prediction that you can make that the UN, which has been really stuck in respect of the great power competitions, is slowly and surely eroding the capacity it has to resolve conflicts in the world and to address the developmental challenges in the world. And that is for no other reason, David and Oscar, because of the imposition of a rules-based international order in which some people developed the rules and sought an order for them, favorable for them, but unfavorable to the South. So when you read the notion of non-alignment, you must fundamentally read the notion that there is a voice emerging in the global South that says, we no longer are going to accept this rule-based international order. We have voice, we have agency, and we're going to exert that agency in respect of this matter. Related to that is the issue of Russia. Now, we have been categorical, clear that Russia violated the United Nations Charter when it invaded Ukraine. There is no getting around that. We have said that, we have repeatedly said that, and we have said that even to the Russians, that the way this matter must be resolved, because we believe that your security concerns are legitimate, and because they are legitimate, you must bring them to the United Nations. But unilateralism is not only something the US does. Unilateralism is also something that Russia has been doing. And we are saying, bring your matter before the United Nations. And of course, Russia argues, no, but we're not allowed to bring the matter before we don't buy that, and we think there should be sufficient discussion that takes place in the UN to deal with the legitimate security concerns of Russia. We certainly don't agree with the way they have attempted to resolve it. And it's useful that this word special operations is used, which in special operations, you can't be held accountable for the rules of war, which is also another multilateral agreement. And this is why we, in the latest round of the Ukrainian peace plan that was held in Montreal, A, we participated, and B, we offered to mediate in respect of the return of what is called the human dimension, the civilians that are held, the arbitrarily prisoners of war, and children that have been alleged to be captured. So yes, we are very much involved, and non-alignment in that concept is perhaps, yes, we are awakening voices to speak in regard of saving the multilateral international rule-based order. And see how I'll put it: multilateral international based order, not rules-based order. So you would know, David, that yesterday I appeared before the summit, and one of the issues that emerged was this G7, G20 linkage. And I think what is so unique about this G7, G20 linkage, and we really are going to push for it to happen, is because it's happening at the time in which international law is breaking down right in front of our eyes. Whatever is happening in Palestine, you will see that international law has been unable to impose its will against the impunity of Israel. And I think that is a matter that all of us who profess to believe in the international law order system, multilateralism, has to do more, including whether we should evoke the clause about the responsibility to protect by all means necessary. And I think that debate has to happen, and I think that debate is coming. I think there are discussions within the United Nations and the General Assembly about what do we do in the face of the impunity of Israel. But we've also seen how in the last few days, the right to defend ourselves, which is Israel's claim, has translated into a right to invade another country, because that is exactly what Israel has done in respect of Syria. They're using the right to defend to now go the right to invade, and which is another violation of the international rule-based system that we all believe in. So I think, and I would really certainly push that one of the theme discussions is whether in the G7 or G20, and particularly because we have agency in the G20, is to raise the question, quo vadis the multilateral order? What do we still believe in the multilateral order? Can we get a recommitment to the values and the principles of the multilateral order? And we shouldn't let the very notion of international cooperation as reflected by that multilateral international law order just be forgotten about, because everything else you are going to be talking about will eventually translate into unilateral action. And you can see that unilateral action is what has brought us here to this incredible inflection point of the polycrisis. So those will be my view. And of course, we cannot continue both in the G20 or the G7 as business as usual. You know, we're going to talk about financing, we're going to talk about the right of women and so forth. Yes, we must talk about all of that. But the fundamental thing that keeps us together is broken. And I'm hoping that in the G7 and the G20 in particular, that discussion will receive the necessary attention.
Well, thank you very much, Mo. Really appreciate that intervention. And I think that last piece in and of itself would be a fascinating CIC or Africa Study Group seminar going forward to talk about the possibilities on that score. Marcia, do I have more time for the fireside questions, or do you want to open it? Do you want me to open it up now to those participants? I realize we probably have about 10 minutes left.
I think we just have 10 minutes. So, and I'm not seeing questions coming up on the Q&A. So are you seeing any separately for you? No. Okay, so why don't you, I'm going to just pitch in one question.
Please.
To go back to the kind of domestic framing side of the discussion. And that is sort of, okay, the Government of National Unity has stretched out, has brought in a very large number of different groupings, has managed to exclude 2 troublesome groups, seems to be getting on top of a couple of issues. But is it possible for that kind of organizations to hang together for long enough? It is by itself a very broad church. And one of the questions, and of course this reminds me, the issues with the ANC and the Communist Party and the trade unions and all that, all the tensions within those broad church. So I'm just going to try back a question on assessment of its capacity to move forward. Can it stay together and do some of these, deal with these challenges?
Well, thanks, Marcia. I mean, I think that is the proverbial question. Will the GNU survive the test of time?
Yeah.
And what does that mean? Is the test of time 2029? There's certainly going to be a lot of tension with the upcoming local government election in 2026, and renewed tensions and so forth will play out. But I think that the GNU is necessary for the ANC. And I think that the ANC is very clear on this. We need to make this work. It is a choice we've made. It needs to be managed in the best interests of the majority of South Africans. As we go to the polls in 2029, we can yet again draw our battle lines and see whether the people feel comfortable with giving any particular party the majority votes again. So it is critical for the ANC. It is equally critical for the DA and some of the other parties in the GNU, because if they leave the GNU, then the blame can be squarely placed at their doorstep that they are the ones that don't have the interest of the majority at heart, and that they caused the government to falter. And we need to then rethink again, what is it that we are going to do? And this is what makes it so interesting, that even on matters that they thought were fundamental, they now have to go back to the drawing board and say, is this so fundamental that we are prepared to walk out of the GNU government? And evidently, we have not reached that point yet. I don't think it's going to be reached anytime soon. I think that there's now been a mechanism put in place where the negotiators can meet behind closed doors and actually try and wrestle out some of these tension points in the best interest of the country going forward. So excellent question. It's on everyone's minds and lips, but I do think that the GNU is going to hold together precisely for the reasons that I've outlined.
Thank you. Before David, before I let you go in, there is also a hands up from Sheikh Bangura. Sheikh, do you want to pose a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Dave and Oscar. As a former UN staff, I simply have to ask this question. As you know, discussions are going on the membership of Africa and the Security Council. Oscar, can you tell us what is going inside South Africa on this issue? Is South Africa going to represent Africa at the Security Council? Is there a wish?
I think first and foremost, the South African government don't want to be seen as if it is a hegemon and therefore must be at the table representing Africa. I think that the first prize from the South Africans is that Africa must have representation. And I think I can confidently say the latest proposal that Africa is given a permanent seat with no veto power is not going down very well. It went down like a lead balloon because it was just seen as a joke. So I think deep down, countries like like South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt does see themselves as representing the continent on a reformed UN Security Council, but in true African tradition, they will certainly not verbalize that.
In public.
In public, yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
At the African Union, there's a different set of conversations going on, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, Marcia, if I could just come back to your
please do.
Domestic piece, just to add on a little bit to Oscar's bit, because I largely align, but I'm always struck myself when thinking about South Africa's democratic political history, and that the ANC has actually been effectively a coalition since 1994, right? It's been the tripartite alliance. The coalition was just negotiated in a different way. So I think, South Africa, from a government and a governance perspective, is quite used to coalitions and the need for the necessary horse trading that goes into that. So, be it Ramaphosa, be it the presidency, be it the ANC, I think there's a recognition that, to make this work, and I think there's a genuine commitment to make it work, there's going to have to be a give and take. And there are going to be different moments where that seems a lot more precarious than before.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, gentlemen, we're coming to the end of our time. I'm going to ask both of you if you want to make any wrap-up final comments, and then we'll turn to Sheikh to close the session.
I only need to say a big thanks to the CIC and the Africa Study Group for making this opportunity possible. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I want to echo that sentiment. Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure. You force me to think very hard, a difficult audience, especially when you have the High Commissioner there, who I greatly respect. But yeah, I think there's still lots to be talked about. How the GNU is going to deal with some of the hotspots on the continent, the deployment of South African forces in the DRC and elsewhere, the developments in the Sahel, which is of course of concern, and we don't know how that's going to play out, as Dr. Baguri indicated in his opening remarks. So lots to still ponder about, but I'm sure we will have an opportunity another time to talk about those.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both very much and hope that we will perhaps get back to you in the spring when we can see the next evolution of these issues and affairs. And so, Sheikh, over to you to do the final closing comments.
Merci, Marcia. As always, your deep and profound knowledge of African issues makes you an excellent moderator for discussion on those matters. Merci beaucoup. On behalf of the Africa Study Group, I would like to thank our speakers, panelists, for their excellent conversation and using this very modern way of intellectual conversation, as mentioned by Ambassador Sheikh. Professor David Hornsby is the Vice Provost of and Associate Vice President Academic and a professor at Carleton Norman Peterson School of International Affairs. Dr. Oscar Van Heerden, a well-known South African commentator on current events, who has an academic background in international political economy with an emphasis on Africa, SADC in particular. Thank you very much. I don't think it will be exaggerated if I say you are the best
Yeah.
And we will definitely, Dave, as you suggested, we will follow your suggestion, and then we will work on these and address the different issues that you have suggested to us. And I was very emotional because I have to remind here that when the United Nations was created, I'm mentioning this because Ambassador Sheikh mentioned it, and or two speakers also emphasized this point of the United Nations. When the United Nations was created in 45, so we had only 4 African countries. That was Egypt, South Africa, the former, in his former name, Ethiopia and Liberia. So all the 50 countries that we have now there, they are new, they were not there. And so that's just to give you a sense of the responsibility that Africa has now to overcome the difficulties that we are meeting at the Security Council in having a representation. And we will come back on this issue. We are receiving a lot of emails asking us to address this issue. We will address it, and as a specialist for international law, I will definitely make sure that we have at least 2 hours to go very deep into this very difficult and complicated situation. I would like to thank all my colleagues, Study Group Secretariat, particularly Mafoya Dusumon and my dear sister Mavoena Ono, as well as our colleagues from the CIC National Capital Branch, Mariana, Daniel, and Cameroon, for all the communication support that went into organizing this session. The next Africa Study Group event will be by the end of January 2025, and we will talk about the recent elections and democratic development in Senegal, and we will try to connect also between this discussion. We will try to talk about the departure of the French troops from Senegal and Chad. And the exact date will be soon posted on the Africa Study Group webpage. Please note that this session has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page. That's the dilemma we had to meet due to the fact that we have speakers like Oscar today talking to us from Africa. We have to take into consideration the time difference. And I have to seize this opportunity to say thank you so much, Oscar, for staying so late. I think it's now almost 10 o'clock in Cape Town. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks.
The Africa Study Group, to remind, is directly affiliated with the CIC, the Canadian International Council, and we encourage our members, friends, to join the CIC National Capital Branch. I will say the best branch. And this invitation is extended to our members and our audience, both in Canada and outside of Canada. This concludes our session. Depending on where you are, dear friends, I wish you a good afternoon and an excellent night. Thank you all, and see you next time. À la prochaine.
Okay.